differently headed Nick. It was a particularly dreary Tuesday morning in December when Harry woke up to find a glittering, rainbow-coloured notice floating above their bed. The parchment was covered in what appeared to be holographic inclusion symbols and smelled faintly of lavender and social justice. Mandatory sensitivity training, the notice proclaimed in swirling, politically correct font. All students are required to attend a workshop on the respectful interaction with the differently alive community presented by Sir Nicholas de Windsor-Porpington, now known as Differently Headed Nick. Failure to attend will result in mandatory enrollment in our new unconscious bias against ghosts rehabilitation program. Harry groaned and rolled over, accidentally knocking the notice onto Neville's bed. Neville woke up with a start, read the notice, and immediately began hyperventilating. "Oh no, oh no, oh no," Neville wheezed. "I called him nearly headless Nick just last week. Do you think he heard me? Am I going to be reported to the Diversity Committee?" "Neville, calm down," Harry said, though they weren't feeling particularly calm themselves. "It's just sensitivity training. How bad could it be?" Famous last words. The training was scheduled for the Great Hall immediately after breakfast, which meant everyone was trapped. There was no sneaking out, no claiming illness, no convenient emergencies. Even the professors looked like they'd rather be grading essays on the most boring possible topics than attending whatever this was about to become. Differently headed Nick had really gone all out for the occasion. The Great Hall had been transformed into what could only be described as a safe space nightmare. Rainbow banners hung from the ceiling, each one proclaiming different variations of ghostly pride, differently alive and proud. Transparency is beautiful, ectoplasm positivity, and most bizarrely, my corporeal status is not your business. The ghost himself floated at the front of the hall, looking more dramatic than Harry had ever seen him. His usual Tudor-era ruff had been replaced with what appeared to be a pride flag worn as a cape, and he'd somehow managed to make his translucent form even more translucent, presumably to make a point about visibility. "Welcome, welcome, my living friends," Nick began, his voice echoing with newfound confidence. "I want to start by saying how brave you all are for being here today. I know that confronting your unconscious bias against the differently alive community can be challenging, but growth often is." Draco Malfoy, who was sitting in the front row looking like he'd swallowed a particularly sour lemon, raised his hand immediately. "Excuse me, but isn't this a bit much? I mean, we've all been perfectly polite to you for years." Nick's expression became what Harry could only describe as the disappointed but not surprised. "Draco, may I call you Draco, what you've just demonstrated is a perfect example of what we call ghost lighting. You're dismissing my lived experience as a member of the differently alive community by claiming that your behavior has been perfectly polite. But politeness, Draco, is not the same as acceptance." "But you're a ghost," Draco said, looking genuinely confused. "What else would we call you?" "I prefers differently alive person," Nick replied patiently. "The term ghost has centuries of negative connotations. It implies that I'm somehow lesser than, or that my existence is inherently frightening or unwelcome." Hermione, who had been frantically taking notes since the moment Nick started speaking, raised her hand enthusiastically. "This is fascinating. I had no idea that the differently alive community faced such systemic discrimination. Are there other turns we should avoid?" Nick beamed at her, or at least, Harry assumed he was beaming. It was hard to tell with the whole translucent thing. "Excellent question, Hermione. Yes, there are many problematic terms. Spook, spectre, phantasm, wraith, all of these carry negative implications. We prefer differently alive persons or transparency-positive individuals." "What about the dead?" asked Seamus innocently. The temperature in the Great Hall dropped noticeably. Nick's form flickered with what appeared to be righteous indignation. "Seamus," Nick said slowly, "that is perhaps the most offensive term you could use. I am not dead. I am differently alive. My corporeal status may have changed, but I am still a person with feelings, thoughts, and experiences. Using the D word perpetuates the harmful binary between living and differently alive individuals." "But you literally died," Seamus pointed out. "I mean, your head was nearly cut off. That's usually considered fatal." My head is differently attached, Nick corrected firmly. And yes, I experienced a transition from traditional life to transparent life, but that doesn't make me dead. It makes me evolved. Harry glanced around the hall and saw that most of the students looked as confused as they felt. Even Professor McGonagall appeared to be questioning her life choices. Now, Nick continued, floating closer to the students, I want to address some of the microaggressions that the differently alive community faces on a daily basis. How many of you have ever walked through a ghost? Several hands went up sheepishly. And how did that make you feel? Cold, offered Ramad tentatively. Exactly. Nick exclaimed. You felt cold and uncomfortable. But did any of you stop to think about how I felt? About how violating it is to have living persons walk through my personal space without consent. But you're see-through, Draco said. How are we supposed to know where your personal space is? That's transparentism, Nick replied matter-of-factly. The assumption that because someone is transparent, they don't have the same rights to personal space as opaque individuals. Hermione was practically vibrating with excitement. Oh my gosh, this is opening up so many new areas of study. Are there other forms of discrimination against the differently alive community? Oh, Hermione, where do I even begin? Nick sighed dramatically. There's the assumption that all differently alive persons are scary or malevolent. There's the expectation that we should be constantly available for entertainment, though, Nick, float through this wall for us. Nick, can you make that spooky noise? It's exhausting. I never thought about it that way, Harry admitted. I'm sorry if I ever made you feel uncomfortable. Thank you, Harry, Nick said warmly. That's exactly the kind of growth I'm hoping to see today. Now, let's talk about some practical ways you can be better allies to the differently alive community. He conjured a glittering chart that appeared to be made of condensed ectoplasm. First, never assume someone's corporeal status. Just because someone appears solid doesn't mean they identify as fully living. Second, always ask for consent before walking through someone's personal space, regardless of their transparency level. Third, use inclusive language. Instead of a living room, try existent room. Instead of dead serious, try indifferently alive serious. This is mental, muttered Ramad under his breath. Excuse me. Nick said sharply, his form flickering with offense. Did you just use ableist language to describe my presentation? Ramad went pale. What? I just meant it was crazy. And there's another one. Crazy is a harmful term that stigmatizes those with mental health differences. Really, Mr. Ulwazer, I expected better from you. But I didn't mean. Impact matters more than intent, Nick interrupted. Your words have power, and using language that marginalizes vulnerable communities contributes to systemic oppression. At this point, Professor Snape, who had been sitting in the back row looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the universe, stood up slowly. The entire hall held its breath. Nick, Snape said in his most dangerous voice, with all due respect, and I mean that in the most minimal way possible, this is some straight-up bullshit. The collective gasp from the students was audible. Several first years looked like they might faint. Professor Snape. McGonagall hissed. You can't say that. What me? Snape replied calmly. I've been dead, excuse me, differently alive, for periods of time myself, and let me tell you something, being dead doesn't make you special. It doesn't give you the right to police everyone else's language or demand that the entire school restructure their vocabulary around your feelings. Professor Snape, that's incredibly problematic, Hermione began. Sit down, Granger, Snape snapped. I'm not finished. Nick, you've been floating around this castle for 500 years complaining about your nearly severed head. Now you want to rebrand yourself as differently headed and lecture teenagers about microaggressions? Get a grip, man. Nick's form was practically vibrating with indignation. Professor Snape, I'm going to have to report this conversation to the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Your language is creating a hostile environment for differently alive individuals. Good luck with that, Snape said dryly. I'm sure they'll be very interested in your complaint about someone pointing out that being dead doesn't make you the victim of systemic oppression. I am not dead. You're talking to us through a severed head that's hanging on by a thread of ghost skin. I'm pretty sure that qualifies as dead in most dictionaries. My head is differently attached. Your head is fact up, is what it is. The silence that followed lasted for hours, it seemed. Even the portraits on the wall seemed to be holding their breath. "That's it," Nick declared dramatically. "I'm calling an emergency meeting of the Hogwarts Diversity Committee. This level of discrimination cannot be tolerated in our learning environment." "You do that," Snape replied, sitting back down. "I'll be in my office, not giving a damn about your feelings." As Snape swept out of the hall, his black robes billowing behind him, Nick turned back to the students with what appeared to be renewed determination. "This," he said, gesturing toward the door where Snape had exited, "is exactly the kind of systemic discrimination that the differently alive community faces every day." Professor Snape's reaction demonstrates the deeply ingrained biases that exist in our society. "But Professor Snape is black," pointed out a confused third year. "Isn't he discriminated against too?" "Discrimination is not a competition," Nick replied firmly. "We must recognize that individuals can experience multiple forms of oppression simultaneously. However, that doesn't excuse Professor Snape's transparentism and differently alive phobia. Can we talk about something else?" Harry asked desperately. "Maybe some practical tips for interacting with ghosts, differently alive persons." "Certainly." Nick brightened immediately. "Let's discuss proper etiquette. First, always announce your presence when entering a room where a differently alive person might be present. We don't always notice living persons immediately, and it can be startling. "How are we supposed to know if there's a ghost in the room if we can't see them?" asked Neville. "That's a great question. You should always assume that there might be a differently alive person present. It's better to err on the side of inclusion. So we should announce ourselves every time we enter any room." Hermione asked, still taking notes. "Exactly. A simple hello, any differently alive persons present, will suffice." "That seems a bit excessive," Draco muttered. "Excessive is thinking that your convenience is more important than someone else's comfort," Nick replied sharply. "Now, let's talk about appropriate conversation topics. Please don't ask us how we died, that's very personal information. Don't ask us to demonstrate our abilities for your entertainment. And please don't make assumptions about our emotional state based on our appearance." "But you're always floating and moaning," pointed out Lavender Brown. "How else are we supposed to interpret that?" "That's a harmful stereotype," Nick said patiently. "Not all differently alive persons moan. Some of us sigh wistfully. Some of us hum. Some of us are perfectly quiet. And floating is simply our natural state of being. It doesn't indicate our emotional state any more than your walking indicates yours." "This is getting ridiculous," Ramad whispered to Harry. "I heard that, Mr. Alwazer," Nick said sharply. "And I want to address something important here. The word ridiculous is often used to dismiss legitimate concerns about discrimination. When you call someone's lived experience ridiculous, you're essentially saying that their feelings don't matter. But some things are actually ridiculous," Ramad protested. "Who gets to decide what's ridiculous?" Nick challenged. "You? The living community? Don't you think the differently alive community should have a say in determining what constitutes reasonable accommodation?" "I think everyone's losing their minds," Draco said loudly. "This is completely insane." "Ableist language again," Nick sighed. "Really, students, we need to do better. Insane is a harmful term that stigmatizes mental health differences. What are we supposed to say instead?" Harry asked, genuinely trying to be helpful. "Try unreasonable or illogical or problematic," Nick suggested. "There are many alternatives that don't perpetuate harmful stereotypes." "This is unreasonable," Draco said pointedly. "Thank you for adjusting your language," Nick beamed. "That's exactly the kind of growth I'm hoping to see." The training continued for another hour, covering topics like inclusive seating arrangements for differently alive persons. Apparently they needed to reserve empty chairs for ghosts who might want to sit. Culturally sensitive Halloween celebrations, ghost costumes were now considered offensive, and creating welcoming environments for transparent positive individuals, which seemed to involve a lot of temperature adjustments and special lighting. By the time Nick finally dismissed them, most of the students looked like they'd been through a particularly brutal defense against the dark arts lesson. Remember, Nick called out as they filed out of the hall, this is just the beginning of your journey toward becoming better allies to the differently alive community. I'll be posting additional resources in the common rooms, and I'm available for one-on-one consultations if anyone wants to discuss their unconscious bias. I need a drink, muttered Professor McGonagall as she passed Harry. Professor, Harry said quickly, isn't drinking during school hours against the rules? Mr. Potter, McGonagall replied wearily, after what I've just witnessed, I'm beginning to think that rules are just social constructs designed to perpetuate systemic oppression. Now if you'll excuse me, I need to go re-evaluate my entire approach to education. As the students dispersed, Harry couldn't help but notice that nearly headless differently headed Nick, looked remarkably pleased with himself. He was floating near the entrance, handing out what appeared to be informational pamphlets about transparent rights and differently alive activism. Harry, he called out as they tried to sneak past. I wanted to thank you for your participation today. Your questions showed real engagement with the material. Thanks. Harry replied uncertainly. I hope you'll consider joining our new student organization, Students for Differently Alive Acceptance. We meet every Tuesday in the abandoned classroom on the 3rd floor. Well, I say abandoned, but that's really just another example of living-centric language. The classroom isn't abandoned, it's just waiting for the right transparent community to make use of it. Oh, think about it, Harry said diplomatically. Wonderful. And remember, being an ally is a verb, not a noun. It's something you do, not something you are. As Harry finally escaped the Great Hall, they found Ramad waiting in the corridor, looking deeply troubled. Harry, he said seriously, I think I need to have a conversation with Nick about intersectionality. As a Muslim, I'm also part of a marginalized community, and I feel like the differently alive rights movement could benefit from a more inclusive approach that recognizes religious discrimination as well. Harry stared at him. Ramad, please tell me you're not going to start another awareness campaign. Well, I hadn't planned on it, but after today's presentation, I'm realizing that there's a real opportunity here to build bridges between different oppressed communities. Maybe we could organize a joint event, solidarity between the differently alive and religiously diverse communities. I'm going to go lie down, Harry said faintly. That's probably for the best, Ramad agreed. Confronting your privilege can be emotionally exhausting. But don't worry, the discomfort you're feeling is just your unconscious bias being challenged. It's a sign that you're growing. As Harry trudged up to Gryffindor Tower, they couldn't help but wonder if maybe the Dursleys had been right about one thing, the wizarding world was definitely getting stranger every year. Behind them, they could hear Nick's voice echoing through the corridor as he continued his impromptu activism session. Remember, students, silence is violence. If you're not actively supporting the differently alive community, you're complicit in our oppression. Harry picked up their pace. They had a feeling that this was just the beginning of what was going to be a very long year.